The wind had been screaming for 2 days, a high, thin sound that tore at the nerves. It was the kind of storm that scoured the land, freezing the marrow in the bone and burying the world in a white, blinding emptiness. This was Wyoming, in the dead of 1881, and the land was a merciless master. Silas Merrick felt the cold through his thick wool coat as he pushed against the cabin door, the wind trying to rip it from his grasp. He leaned his shoulder into it and forced it shut, the heavy wooden bar thudding into place. The silence inside the small cabin was a relief, broken only by the crackle of the stove and the howl of the wind trying to find a way in. He had lived alone for 5 years, since Sarah and the boy had been put in the frozen ground. His life was a rhythm of chores, a pattern of survival that left no room for thought or feeling. He woke, he tended the stock, he cut wood, he mended tack, he ate, he slept. The storm was just another chore, a harder one, but a chore all the same. His cattle were huddled in the small lean-to, their backs to the wind. It was the horses he worried on. He pulled his hat lower, wrapped the scarf tighter around his face until only his eyes were showing, and stepped back into the white fury. The barn was only 50 yards from the cabin, but in this, it felt like a mile. He kept his head down, following the rope line he'd strung just for this purpose. To lose your way between the barn and the house was to die. He stumbled against the heavy barn door, his fingers stiff and clumsy on the latch. When he finally forced it open and slipped inside, the relative quiet and the warmth of the animals hit him like a physical blow. He stamped the snow from his boots, his breath clouding in the lantern light. His 2 horses, a draft and a buckskin, snorted a greeting from their stalls, but something was wrong. The latch on the feed bin was broken, snapped clean at the hinge. He'd fixed it just last week. He stood still, listening. The wind moaned through the rafters, but beneath it, there was another sound, a rustle. He was not a man given to fear, but a deep caution settled over him. A wolf, maybe, or a mountain cat, desperate enough to come this close. He grabbed the pitchfork that leaned against the wall, its tines sharp and clean. He moved slowly toward the back of the barn, where the hay was stacked high for the winter. The lantern cast strange, dancing shadows. "Who's there?" His voice was a low growl, rough from disuse. The rustling stopped. Then came a sound, a whimper so soft he almost mistook it for the wind. It came from the largest stack of hay bales, in the darkest corner. He raised the lantern high. "Come on out, I won't ask again." He moved closer, pulling back a loose bale with the pitchfork, and he saw her. She was burrowed into the hay, a small, shivering mound of rags. For a long moment, he thought she was a child. Then she moved, and the lantern light fell on her face. It was a woman, though she was thin enough to be a girl. Her hair was matted with ice and something dark that looked like dried blood. She was barefoot, her feet a sickening blue-white. The rags she wore looked like tattered undergarments, thin cotton that offered no protection at all, with a torn, bloody shawl clutched around her shoulders. She looked at the pitchfork, then at him. Her eyes were wide, not just with fear, but with a terror so deep it looked like madness. She tried to scramble backward, deeper into the hay, but she was too weak. She held up one hand, the fingers raw and bleeding. "Please," she whispered, her voice a dry crackle. "Don't hurt me. Please, I won't make a sound. Please don't hurt me." Silas stared, the pitchfork lowering in his hand. He had seen frozen cattle, found trappers who had lost their way. He had never seen this. This was a person, on the edge of death. In his barn, he set the lantern down on a bale. He dropped the pitchfork. He held up his empty hands, though he wasn't sure why. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "You'll die out here." He stepped forward. She flinched so violently she hit her head against the wooden wall. A dull thud. She cried out. A small, sharp sound of pain. That settled it. He couldn't leave her here. He moved fast, before she could protest again. He shed his heavy coat, the sheepskin lining still warm, and threw it over her. He bent down and slid one arm under her back, the other under her knees. She weighed nothing. She felt like a bundle of dry sticks. brittle and cold. She began to fight him then. A weak, frantic threshing. "No, no, please, let me go. I'll leave, please." "You'll be dead in 10 minutes, he said, his voice flat. He pulled the coat tighter around her and lifted her against his chest. He grabbed the lantern and kicked the barn door open, turning his back to the wind to shield her as he plunged back into the storm. She was still muttering, "Please, no, please," into his chest as he fought his way back to the cabin. He kicked the cabin door shut and barred it. The warmth of the room was thick. He carried her straight to the hearth and set her down on the worn bearskin rug that lay before the fire. She was shivering so badly her teeth chattered. A rapid, painful clicking. He stoked the fire, adding 2 more logs until it roared, throwing heat into the room. He turned back to her. The coat had fallen open. The rags she wore were frozen stiff, clinging to her skin. Her feet were worse than he thought. The skin was waxy and gray. "We have to get those wet things off you," he said, his voice practical. He reached for the hem of the frozen shift. Her reaction was instant and violent. She scrambled backward on the rug, crab-walking away from him until she hit the stone of the hearth. Her eyes were wild. "No!" she screamed, the word ripping from her throat. Don't make me undress! Please, please, I'm begging you!" The plea stopped him cold. It was not the plea of a modest woman. It was the shriek of a horse with its leg in a trap. It was pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at her, truly looked at her. The bruising on her face, the split lip, the blood in her hair. He had seen brands on cattle that looked less painful. He backed away, raising his hands again. All right, I won't." He stood there for a long moment. The man and the woman, the fire roaring between them. She was trapped. She would lose her feet, maybe her legs, if he didn't get the frozen, filthy rags off her. But if he touched her, he feared she might break completely. He made a decision. He turned from her and went to his trunk. He pulled out his sharpest skinning knife. She made a small, choked sound when she saw it, but he ignored her. He went to the stove and poured water from the kettle into a basin, adding cold water from the bucket until it was just lukewarm. He grabbed clean rags from a drawer. He knelt by the rug, placing the basin and the knife on the floor, well away from her. "I have to cut the cloth," he said, his voice quiet. "It's frozen to you. You'll lose your feet." She stared at the knife, trembling. "I will not," he said, speaking slowly, as if to a spooked horse. "Touch you. I will only cut the cloth. You can stay in the coat, all right?" She didn't answer. She just watched him, her breath coming in shallow, quick pants. He took it as assent. He moved slowly, painfully slowly. He kept the heavy coat draped over her entire body, hiding her from his own view. He lifted just the edge, exposing only her gray, frozen feet. He took the knife. "Don't move," he said. She flinched when the cold steel touched the fabric, but she didn't move. He worked with a surgeon's care, his large, calloused hands surprisingly steady. He cut the frozen cotton away from her ankles, then her calves. The cloth was stuck fast with frozen blood and mud. He had to peel it away in small, careful strips, revealing raw, weeping skin underneath. He did it all under the tent of his coat, working by feel as much as by sight. He kept his eyes focused on the task, on the wounds, not on the woman beneath the wool. When he was done, he tossed the filthy, bloody rags into the fire. They hissed and sputtered. He took one of the clean cloths, dipped it in the lukewarm water, and began to clean her feet. She gasped when the water touched her, a sharp intake of breath, but she didn't pull away. He worked in silence. When he had cleaned the skin as best he could, he dried her feet gently. He went to his medical tin and took out a jar of salve. He applied it thickly to the worst of the broken skin. "You need to stay warm," he said, "but not too warm. Not yet." He moved to the small alcove that held his bed. He stripped his own blankets from it, leaving only the mattress. He carried her, still wrapped in his coat, and laid her on the cot he kept by the fire. He spread the blankets over her, tucking them in tightly. She had been silent for a long time. Her eyes were closed. He thought she might be sleeping. He put a hand to her forehead to check for fever and recoiled. She was burning. Just as he registered the heat, her eyes rolled back in her head. She went limp, passing out completely. Silas swore, a low, harsh sound. He spent the rest of that night, and all of the next day, in a battle. The fever took her, and she drifted into a world he could not reach. She thrashed and moaned, but she never spoke a coherent word. He sat in the chair by the cot, forcing sips of water and thin broth between her cracked lips. He bathed her face and neck with cool water. The simple, repetitive acts of nursing brought the ghosts into the room. He saw Sarah, her face pale and slick with sweat, her hand clutching his. He heard her desperate, tired breaths. He remembered the smell of sickness and blood in this very cabin. He remembered the midwife, a stern, hard woman from the next ranch over, shaking her head. He remembered the awful, empty silence after the baby. A boy had come into the world. Still and blue, he had failed them. He had been strong enough to break horses, to build a cabin from nothing but pine and muscle. But he had not been strong enough to save his wife or his son. He had locked that part of himself away, buried it under 5 years of hard work and harder silence. Now, this strange, broken woman had brought it all back. He pushed the memories down. He focused on the task. He did not let this one die. On the third day, the fever broke. He woke in his chair to find her watching him. Her eyes were clear, but still hollow, still terrified. He stood up, his joints aching. "You're awake." She said nothing. She just watched him. "I'll get you some broth," he said. He busied himself at the stove, his back to her. He felt her eyes on him, a physical weight. He poured the broth into a tin cup and brought it to her. He held it out. She stared at the cup, then at his hand. She did not take it. After a long moment, he sighed. He set the cup down on the small crate beside the cot. "It's there," he said. He went and sat back in his chair, across the room, by the window. He picked up a piece of leather tack and a needle and began to stitch. His movements practiced and sure. They stayed that way for hours. The wind howled, the fire crackled. He stitched. She lay still, watching him. He saw her, from the corner of his eye, slowly, painfully, push herself up. She didn't sleep lying down. She slept sitting up, her back braced against the wall, the blankets piled around her. She looked like a cornered animal, ready to bolt. She would not speak. He asked her name. She pressed her lips together, the split in the lower one cracking open again. He asked her where she had come from. She turned her head and stared at the log wall. He stopped asking. The days fell into a new, strange rhythm. He would wake before dawn, light the fire, and go out to the barn. The storm had not let up. It had, if anything, grown worse. It was a full-blown blizzard, a whiteout that erased the world. There was no way in, and no way out. The cabin was a small, warm ship in a frozen, raging sea. When he came back in, he would prepare food, oatmeal, jerky, sometimes a stew from the dried vegetables and salted meat he kept. He would put her portion on the crate. He would leave a cup of fresh water. He went to his trunk and pulled out the heaviest quilt, the one Sarah had made, a pattern of blue and white squares. He folded it carefully and set it on the crate, next to the food. He never touched her. He never crossed the invisible line he had drawn around her cot. He learned to give her privacy. When she ate, she did so only when he was turned away, his back to her. She ate like a wolf, fast and desperate, as if afraid the food would be taken away. He would busy himself by the fire, mending his clothes or oiling his rifle, pretending not to hear the small sounds of her eating. She never used the chamber pot he left near the cot. She would wait for hours until he bundled himself up to go to the barn. Only when she was completely alone in the cabin would she move. When he came back, the pot would be used and set back, the blankets on the cot rearranged. Sometimes, when she thought he was asleep in his chair, he would watch her. She stared into the fire for hours, her face blank, but her hands were never still. She would pick at the threads of the quilt, her fingers twisting and turning, rubbing the fabric as if to reassure herself it was real. And in her sleep, she remembered. The jolting of the wagon. The canvas roof was rotten, smelling of mildew and stale whiskey. The man, Hendry, had flat, dead eyes and a beard stained with tobacco. He owned the wagon. He owned the 3 other girls huddled in the back, their faces dull with hunger and fear. He owned her. Her father, a good man broken by drink and a bad winter, had sold her to pay a debt. Sold her like a sack of feed. They were traveling, heading for the railhead in Cheyenne. Hendry traded in whatever he could, sometimes pelts, sometimes whiskey. This trip, it was women. She remembered the last stop, a collection of sod huts and tents that called itself a town. Hendry had tried to sell her to the saloon keeper. The man had looked at her, pinched her arm, and laughed. "She's half frozen and scrawny as a plucked chicken," he'd said. "I'll give you $10. "She's got spirit," Hendry had snarled, yanking her head back by her hair. "She'll fetch 50 in Cheyenne. A brothel'll pay good for one with spirit." The saloon keeper had spat. Not worth the trouble. That night, Hendry had been angry. He had been drinking. He'd backhanded her, splitting her lip. She had waited. She had waited for weeks, for her chance. The guard he'd posted, a dull-witted boy named Jeb, had gotten into the whiskey. She had watched him nod off, his chin hitting his chest. She had slipped out the back of the wagon. She had no shoes. She had no coat. She grabbed the thin, bloody shawl from one of the other girls, who had been coughing up blood for a week. She ran into the snow. She didn't know where she was going. She just ran away from the road, toward the hills. She ran until the pain in her feet turned to numbness. She heard shouting, maybe a dog, but the wind was rising, and it swallowed the sounds. She hid in a cleft of rock, burying herself in a snowdrift. Until morning. She walked for a day, maybe 2. She lost track. The white was everywhere. Finally, staggering, blind with cold and hunger. She had seen the dark shape of the barn. In the cabin, the blizzard howled. The snow piled up past the windowsills, turning the light in the room a dull, gray blue. They were completely, utterly isolated. Silas knew the fire was their life. He needed to keep the wood box full. He would pull on his coat and hat, wrap his scarf, and go outside. He didn't go far, just to the woodpile near the porch. He had a large pine trunk there he was slowly working through. He would chop. The sound of the axe was the only thing that could stand against the wind. Thunk, thunk, thunk. Inside, she listened. It was a steady sound, a rhythm. It was not the sharp, angry sound of a fist hitting a wall. It was not the crack of a whip. It was the sound of work. It was the sound of a man keeping them alive. He was out there. He was not in here. The sound became a strange, solitary comfort. It was the sound of her safety. On the 5th night, he was jerked from a shallow doze in his chair. A scream, a terrible, jagged sound that ripped the silence of the cabin to shreds. He was on his feet, his hand on the rifle by the door, before he was even fully awake. Then he heard the words, and his blood went cold. "No, no, get off me. Don't touch me. Please, I said no. Don't. Get your hands off me." She was not screaming at him. She was in a nightmare, reliving something. She was begging unseen men. He moved to the edge of the sleeping alcove. He could see her, thrashing under the blankets, her hands held up as if to ward off blows. She was sobbing, a desperate, animal sound. He wanted to go to her. He wanted to put his hand on her shoulder, to shake her awake, to tell her, "You're safe. You're in my cabin. No one is here." But he stopped. He saw her, in his mind's eye, scrambling away from him on the rug. He heard her shriek, "Don't make me undress." He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that his touch, even a kind one, would be a violation. It would be no different to her than the touch of the men in her nightmare. So he stayed where he was. He stood just outside the circle of her cot, his knuckles white on the rifle stock, and he listened. He listened to her scream and beg and weep. He stood there, a large, strong man, rendered completely helpless. He was shaken to the very core of the foundation he had built for himself. Finally, the screams subsided. They turned to choked sobs, and then to small, hitched breaths. He waited until she was quiet, until her breathing evened out into the shallow breaths of an exhausted sleep. He did not go back to his chair. He stood there, by the cold wall, for the rest of the night, watching over her. The next morning, the silence in the cabin was different. It was no longer empty. It was full. It was charged with the things they both refused to say. She was pale, her eyes purple with shadow. She would not look at him at all. He set down her plate of oatmeal and a piece of jerky. He set down the cup of water. The space between his chair and her cot felt 100 miles wide. The air was thick with her unspoken terror and his unspoken grief. It was thick with the need of two people trapped by a storm, survivors in a world that had tried to kill them both. It was not trust. It was not kindness. It was just the fragile, terrifying, unspoken need to see the next sunrise. The nightmare had left its stain on the morning. The silence in the cabin was brittle, stretched thin. Clara sat on her cot, the quilt clutched to her chest, and watched him. He was a creature of routine. He stoked the fire, he put the coffee pot on, he pulled on his boots. Every move was deliberate, economical, predictable. He was going to the barn. He would be gone for at least half an hour, maybe more in this snow. He glanced at her, his face unreadable. "I'll fetch more wood on the way back," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. He wrapped his scarf, pulled his hat low, and opened the door. The wind and snow blasted into the room. A brief, violent intrusion, and then he was gone, the door thudding shut behind him. She was alone. The silence was absolute. The fear from the nightmare surged, thick and choking in her throat. He had listened to her scream. He had stood there in the dark, and he had listened. He had not come to her, but he had not left either. He had stayed, a silent witness. What did that mean? She couldn't know. The men she had known were cruel, but their cruelty was simple. It was for a purpose. This man, this Silas Merrick, was a puzzle. His gentleness was a mask. His quiet was a threat. She could not read him, and that made him the most dangerous man of all. He was just waiting. He was feeding her, healing her, making her strong again. For what? The thought was a spark in her mind. She would not wait to find out. She would rather die in the snow, clean, than wait for his heavy, quiet hand to finally fall. She scrambled from the cot. Her feet, wrapped in clean rags he had given her, screamed in protest as her weight settled on them. She ignored the pain. She went to the peg by the door. His heavy sheepskin coat was there, the one he had first wrapped her in. It still smelled of him, a scent of wood smoke, leather, and cold air. She pulled it on. The sleeves were far too long, the shoulders impossibly wide. It swallowed her. She grabbed the door bar. It was heavy, but her terror gave her strength. She lifted it, eased the door open just enough to slip through, and plunged into the white. The cold was a slap, a solid, stunning blow that took her breath. The wind tore at her, spinning her around. She had no idea where the barn was, where the road was, where anything was. There was no sky, no ground, just a roaring, featureless world of white. She had seen him use a rope line, but she couldn't find it. She stumbled away from the faint orange glow of the cabin window, pushing into the drifts. The snow was up to her thighs, each step a desperate, lung-searing effort. The coat was a terrible weight, soaking up the snow. She fell, pushed herself up, fell again. Her feet were no longer in pain. They were just gone. 2 blocks of numb wood at the end of her legs. She was not more than 20 yards from the porch when she collapsed for the last time. She could not get up. The snow was soft, the wind a lullaby. It would be easy to sleep. She burrowed into the drift, pulling the heavy coat over her head. It was better this way. Silas fought his way back from the barn, his arms loaded with firewood. The wind had shifted, and the drifts against the cabin were higher than his head. He kept his own head down, following the rope, He almost tripped over the dark mound half buried in the snow, just feet from his own porch. He dropped the wood. He swore. A single, violent word ripped away by the storm. He thought it was a calf, strayed from the lean-to. He brushed the snow away and saw the sleeve of his own coat. He grabbed her, digging her out of the drift. She was limp, a dead weight. He ripped the coat open. Her face was blue-white, her eyes closed, ice clinging to her lashes. He lifted her, his anger a hot, bright thing in his chest. It was not anger at her. It was anger at the storm, at the world, at the raw, stubborn fragility of life. He kicked the door open, the wood he'd dropped forgotten, and carried her inside. He didn't lay her on the rug this time. He took her straight to his own bed in the main room, the one he hadn't used, and laid her down. He stripped the frozen, snow-caked coat from her and threw it to the floor. She was shivering again, a deep, convulsive shuddering that shook the bed frame. He piled every blanket he owned on top of her. He stood over her, his chest heaving, his hands clenched. He was shaking himself, from the cold, from the fear that had seized him when he saw her in the snow. "You fool," he whispered to the unconscious woman. "You goddamn little fool." He pulled his chair from across the room. He did not set it by the fire. He set it beside the bed, so close his knee brushed the mattress. And he sat. He sat there as the light faded from the gray windows. He sat there as the cabin filled with shadows. He did not light the lamp. He just watched the rise and fall of the blankets, listening to the small, hitched breaths that told him she was still alive. He didn't know when he started talking. The words just came, low and rough, into the darkness. "You can't die here," he said, his voice quiet. "I won't have it. Not another one. Not in this house." He talked to the storm, to the ghosts in the room, to her. He didn't know if she could hear. He didn't care. "It's just snow," he whispered. Hours later, his throat raw. "It can't get in. The walls are thick. I built them. You're safe in here. I won't hurt you. I swear it. No one is going to hurt you here." She was not unconscious. She was floating in a cold, gray place. But his voice was an anchor. She lay perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. She listened. He spoke of the wood, of the cattle, of the way the wind sounded in the pines. He wasn't demanding anything. He was just talking, and underneath all the words, she heard the same promise, over and over. "I won't hurt you." She lay in the dark, wrapped in his blankets, and listened to the sound of his voice until the sun came up. When he finally rose from the chair, his joints cracking, she kept her eyes closed. She heard him stoke the fire, heard the scrape of the shovel as he cleared the snow from the porch. When he brought her a cup of broth, she was sitting up, her back against the wall. The terror in her eyes had been replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. She looked at him, her gaze steady for the first time. He set the cup on the bedside crate. "You need to eat." He turned to go back to the fire. "Clara," the word was so soft, he barely heard it. He stopped. He turned back. "What did you say?" "My name," she whispered, her cracked lips barely moving. "It is Clara." He looked at her for a long time. The girl in the hayrick had a name. He nodded, a single, formal dip of his chin. "Clara," he repeated. He went back to his chair, but he left it by the bed. The storm raged for 3 more days, but something in the cabin had broken. The choking tension was gone, replaced by a fragile, wary truce. Clara began to eat. She ate the broth, the oatmeal, the tough, salty jerky. She drank the water he brought, and she began to ask questions. Her voice was thin, rusty from disuse. How long has the storm been?" she asked, her eyes on the snow-caked window. 7 days, Silas said. He was mending a bridle, his fingers busy with the leather. "Since it really set in. 10 days since I found you." She absorbed this. 10 days. A lifetime. "The horses," she said. "You have 2? He looked up, surprised. "Aye, a draft and a buckskin. Are they warm?" "They are. The barn is tight. They have feed." Her questions were all small, practical. about the cabin, the snow, the animals. He answered everyone. He told her about the ranch, how his father had settled the land, how he had built this cabin with his own hands after the original soddy had washed out in a spring flood. And one evening, as the firelight danced on the log walls, he found himself talking about Sarah. He hadn't spoken her name aloud in almost 4 years. She was small, he said, his voice flat, his gaze lost in the flames. From Pennsylvania. She hated the wind here, but she loved the spring, said the flowers were braver here than back east. Clara watched him. She saw the way his hands stilled on the leather, the muscles in his jaw tightening. There was a child, he said, the words forced, as if pulling stones from his own throat. A boy. Neither of them. The winter was hard. The midwife was delayed by a blizzard. Like this one. He stopped. He did not say any more. He bent his head back to his work, his movements jerky, angry. Clara said nothing. She did not offer pity. She did not say she was sorry. She just sat in the bed, in the half-dark, and listened. She gave him her silence. And for Silas, who was drowning in his own, it was a profound, unspoken comfort. She asked nothing of him, and she did not judge. He did not ask about her. He did not ask where she came from, or how she had come to be in his barn. He was afraid to. He was afraid to know what kind of man could do that to another human being. He was afraid of the rage it would stir in him, a rage he had kept leashed for 5 years. The blizzard, their white prison, gave them a strange kind of freedom. There was no outside world. There was only the cabin. Silas had to move, to work. He repaired the latch on the feed bin he'd brought inside. He fixed a chair that had a loose leg, his hands careful as he glued and clamped the wood. Clara watched him. She had been moved back to the cot by the fire, but she did not stay in it all day. She would sit in the other chair, the bearskin rug at her feet, and watch his hands. They were huge, scarred from rope and wood and ice, but they were steady. They were gentle with the splintered wood of the chair. They were precise as he sharpened his axe. One afternoon, he brought a block of pine from the wood box and sat by the fire, his knife in his hand. He began to carve. He was not making anything, just letting the shavings fall, long and thin, onto the hearth. His movements were rhythmic, calming. Thunk, scrape, thunk, scrape. She watched this man. She watched him battle the storm to feed the stock, his shoulders set against the wind. She watched him mend what was broken. She watched him build the fire, his movements sure. The men she had known, Hendry and the others, their strength was for breaking, for hitting, for taking, for tearing. Silas's strength was for mending, for building, for holding the storm at bay. The steady, quiet rhythm of his work began to soothe a raw, panicked place inside her that had not been still for years. The next morning, he was at the small table, cleaning his rifle. He had made coffee for himself and steeped some weak tea for her. He ladled 2 bowls of oatmeal. He set one at the table. He picked up the other to take it to her cot. He stopped. He looked at her, sitting there, watching him. "Can you make it to the table?" he asked. She looked at the table, just 4 feet away. It seemed a great distance. She had been standing, walking a few steps in the cabin, her feet still tender, but healing. She nodded. She pushed herself up from the cot, pulling the quilt around her shoulders. She shuffled to the table, her bare, bandaged feet cold on the wood floor. She sat down in the chair he had fixed. He set the bowl down in front of her. He sat across from her. They ate. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons against the tin bowls and the crackle of the fire. It was the first meal they had shared. It was not comfortable. It was awkward and new and fragile. But it was a beginning. They fell into this new pattern. Meals at the table. Long silences. Broken by small questions. One morning, a few days later, they were at the table with their coffee and tea. A tin of precious hoarded sugar sat between them. He reached for it. At the exact same moment, she did. Her fingers, thin and pale, brushed the back of his hand. The shock was electric. It was hot and sharp, and it jolted them both. She snatched her hand back as if she'd been burned, her eyes widening, a small gasp escaping her. He pulled his own hand back, clearing his throat, his face flushing dark. "Sorry," he muttered, turning his gaze to the rifle parts on the table. "My fault," she whispered, staring into her cup. The air in the cabin, which had just begun to settle, was now charged, humming with a new, unspoken energy. It was no longer just a man and a woman. It was this man and this woman, and they were both, suddenly, terribly aware of it. Clara was healing. Her feet were scarred, but she could walk. The cuts on her face had faded, but she was still wearing his old, threadbare shirt, tucked into the thin rags he had washed for her. She felt like a shadow, like a ghost. She felt dirty, borrowed. His bed, in the main part of the room, was always neatly made. At the foot of it sat a dark wood trunk. She had been looking at it for days. While he was out tending the stock, she opened it. The gilt was a sharp stone in her stomach, but she couldn't stop herself. The smell of lavender and dust rose to meet her. Inside, folded with a care that spoke of love, were a woman's clothes, a simple calico, a dark gray dress for church, and underneath, a dress of worn, soft blue wool. She touched it. The fabric was heavy, real. She pulled it out, holding it up against herself. It was simple, high-necked, with the long sleeves. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever touched. She was still holding it when the cabin door opened. Silas froze, the snow melting on his hat and shoulders. He saw her, and he saw the dress. His face, which had been softening over the past days, turned back into the hard mask of stone she had seen in the barn. "That was my wife's," he said. His voice was not loud. It was dead. Clara flinched, clutching the dress to her. "I know. I am sorry. I shouldn't have." She looked down at her own filthy rags, at his oversized shirt. "I feel so unclean," she whispered, the shame burning her face. I wondered if I might wear it, only until the storm passes, until I can wash, until I can go." He looked from the dress to her face, then down to her bandaged feet. He saw the desperation in her eyes, the humiliation. His jaw worked. He was at war with himself. He saw Sarah laughing, hanging the wash, wearing that very dress, and he saw this broken woman, who had nothing, not even her own name until a few days ago. The battle ended. He gave a single, jerky nod. "Aye," he said, his voice thick. Then he turned, his movement stiff, and walked straight back out the door, into the snow, slamming it shut behind him. Clara washed herself as best she could, her hands shaking, using the basin of lukewarm water by the fire. She put on the blue dress. It was a little short and tight in the shoulders. Sarah had been a small, delicate woman, but it was warm. It was clean. It covered her. She brushed her matted hair with her fingers, tying it back with a piece of twine. She felt, for the first time in a year, almost human. When Silas came back, an hour later, he did not look at her. He stomped the snow from his boots, hung his hat, and went to the stove to pour coffee. He kept his back to her, but he had to turn eventually. She was standing by the fire, her hands clasped. The blue wool softened her, gave her a shape, a substance she had lacked. She was no longer a ghost in his shirt. She was a woman in his wife's dress. He swallowed, a hard, audible movement in his throat. He looked away, his face grim, and sat down to oil his tack. That night, the storm finally began to quiet. The wind had dropped to a low, mournful sigh. The silence in the cabin was heavy. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice small. She was on her cot, he in his chair. He grunted, his eyes on the fire. Not just for the dress," she said, forcing the words out. "For before, when you found me, for not touching me." This made him turn. He looked at her, truly looked at her. She was staring at her hands, which were picking at the wool of the blue dress. He thought for a long time. He thought about her in the hay, her eyes wild. He thought about her plea. "Don't make me undress." He thought about his own 5 years of loneliness, of holding himself back from the world. "You're not mine to touch," he said, his voice rough. She looked up, startled. Her eyes searched his face in the firelight. He was not being cold. He was stating a fact, a right, a truth. He was giving her ownership of herself, a thing she had not had. A strange, painful knot in her chest seemed to ease. The silence that fell now was different. It was not empty, it was full. "Silas?" she whispered. Will you sit with me by the fire?" She pointed to the bearskin rug. It's warmer there." He was surprised. He looked from his chair, to the cot, to the rug. He stood, his joints stiff. He picked up his chair and moved it, setting it on the edge of the rug, closer to the flames. He sat down. She hesitated. Then, pulling the heavy quilt from her cot, she stood up. She did not go back to the cot. She walked the few steps and sat on the rug, near his feet, her back against the cot's frame. She wrapped the quilt around her. He was in his chair. She was on the floor. But they were together. They were sharing the hearth. They sat like that for a long time, saying nothing, the fire painting their faces in orange and gold. For the first time, it was not the silence of fear, or the silence of grief. It was just silence. It was almost peace. The next day, the wind died completely. The silence was absolute, heavy, almost frightening. And then, a shaft of brilliant, painful sunlight cut through the window, striking the floor. The storm had passed. With the silence of the outside world came the noise of the inside one. The storm had been a buffer, a loud, raging excuse not to think, not to feel. Now, there was nothing. No wind to blame for the fear, no snow to hide behind. That night, Clara slept, and the silence let the dreams in. She was in the wagon. The canvas roof, the smell of whiskey and unwashed bodies. Hendry's face, his beard stained, his eyes flat and dead. He was laughing. He was reaching for her. "Time to earn your keep, girlie," he snarled. He grabbed the front of her dress. She screamed. She was fighting, but her arms were heavy, useless. She could hear the other girls crying. She woke with a strangled sob, bolting upright. The cabin was dark, the fire just red embers. Her heart was a trapped bird in her chest. The dream was clinging to her, its filthy hands still on her. She was shaking, and a terrible, low sound of despair tore itself from her throat. She began to cry, not the screams of the nightmare, but the deep, racking sobs of a soul that had given up. Silas was on his feet before his eyes were fully open. He saw her, a shaking silhouette in the dark. He did not stop. He did not hesitate. He walked to the cot and sat on the edge of it, his weight dipping the mattress. She gasped, her sobs cutting off, her hands flying up to ward him off. "No, please." "It's me," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's Silas. You were dreaming. You're in the cabin. You're safe." He did not reach for her. He just sat there, a solid, warm presence in the dark, letting her see him. She stared at him, her eyes wide and wild, her breath catching in her throat. The sobs were still shaking her, violent, uncontrollable tremors. She was freezing, the cold radiating from her skin. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his hand. He laid it on her shoulder, his palm covering the blue wool. He didn't pat her. He didn't rub her back. He just held her, a solid, unmoving weight, a human anchor. She gasped at the contact, a small, shocked sound. He felt her go rigid, ready to bolt. He kept his hand still. She did not pull away. She stayed frozen for a long, taut moment. Then, a shudder ran through her. It was a different kind of tremor, not of fear, but of surrender. She leaned into his hand, just a fraction of an inch. And then, with a choked sound that seemed to come from the deepest part of her, she moved. She leaned forward, her forehead coming to rest against the solid wall of his chest. Silas was stiff. He was not used to this. He had not held another person in 5 years. Awkwardly, he brought his other arm up, pulling the heavy quilt with it, and wrapped it around her shaking shoulders. He held her. He held her as she wept into his shirt, her small, cold hands clutching his sleeves. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He just sat there, solid as the log walls, and let her cry. He felt the moment her exhaustion finally overtook her despair. The sobs lessened. The terrible shaking eased. Her breathing became deeper, though still hitched with spent grief. She was asleep. She didn't move away, and he did not let go. With slow, careful movements, he shifted. He leaned his back against the cabin wall, pulling her with him. She was curled against his side, her head resting on his chest, his arms still around her, the quilt covering them both. She was fully clothed in Sarah's blue dress. He was fully clothed in his shirt and trousers. He sat in the dark, listening to the sound of her breathing. He could feel her heart, beating steadily now, against his ribs, for the first time since she had arrived. Clara was not sitting up, braced for an attack. She was sleeping, and Silas, holding this lost, broken woman, sat awake and watched the embers die, feeling the first painful thaw in the frozen ground of his own heart. Clara woke with a start, the morning light sharp and unfamiliar. Her first thought was of the nightmare. Her second was of the arms that had held her through it. She was on her cot, the heavy quilt tucked around her. Silas was not there. He was across the room, his back to her, feeding logs into the stove. He had not slept in his chair. He had, at some point in the deep, cold hours, laid her back down and returned to his own. The air was still. The wind had stopped. He turned, and their eyes met. The cabin, which had been a large, empty space, suddenly felt impossibly small. A flush crept up Clara's neck. She looked away first. He cleared his throat. "The storms broke," he said. He pulled on his boots. "I have to check the stock. The lean-to might have drifted." He did not mention the night before. He did not mention her tears, or the way she had clung to his shirt. He just grabbed his hat and went out, leaving a gust of bright, cold air in his wake. Clara sat up. The silence of the world was deafening. She was used to the howl of the wind as a shield. Now, there was nothing, just the drip, drip, drip of snow melting from the eaves. She was still in Sarah's blue dress. She ran her hands down the wool. She felt the solid weight of Silas's hand on her shoulder, a phantom warmth that had not faded. She stood. She was a guest, a stray. She was healed, mostly. Her feet were still tender, but the skin had knit. She was strong enough to walk, to stand, to... What? Leave? The thought sent a spike of pure, cold panic through her. The snow was deep. The world was vast and white and empty, and the men from the wagon were somewhere out there. She could not leave, but she could not stay as a burden. When Silas came back, stamping snow from his boots, his face grim, she was not on the cot. She was sitting at the table, his mending basket in her lap. One of his wool socks, the heel worn through, was stretched over her hand. He stopped, his hat in his hand. I found this," she said, her voice small, holding up the sock. "The needle was... I hope it's all right. I'm good with a needle." He looked at the sock. Then, at her, he saw the neat, tight stitches, a small, perfect line of repair. He had just spent an hour digging snow from the roof of the lean-to, his shoulders aching, his mind full of the new, fragile tension in his own home. He had expected to find her hiding. He found her mending his socks. "It's fine," he said, his voice rough. "Thank you." She nodded, her eyes dropping back to her work. A new rhythm began, born of the thaw. The cabin was no longer their entire world. The world was returning. Silas was outside from sunup to sundown, digging out, assessing the damage, and Clara, slowly, timidly, began to claim a space within his life. She started with the small things. She darned his socks. She kept the fire fed. She learned to make the coffee just the way he liked it, strong and bitter. One morning, he came in to find a pot of thin stew bubbling on the stove, made from the dried beans and salted beef he kept. He ate it without comment, but he cleaned the bowl. After a few days, she bundled herself in his heavy coat and followed his tracks to the chicken coop, a small, half-buried shed near the barn. The 4 hens inside were ruffled but alive. She had not been in an enclosed space, other than the cabin, since the wagon. She paused at the door, her heart hammering, but they were just chickens. She pushed the door open. She found an egg, one small, perfect, brown egg, hidden in the straw. She held it in her palm. It was solid. It was real. It was the first thing she had found, had created, in a world that had only ever taken from her. When Silas came in for his noon meal, the egg was on the table. He looked at it. "I found it," she said, a strange, shy pride in her voice. "In the coop. I can feed them. If you'll let me, I can gather the eggs." He nodded. "They're yours to tend, if you've a mind to." So she added that to her list. Every morning she would pull on the boots he had found for her, Sarah's old winter boots, which were blessedly too large and fit over her bandaged feet, and she would make the trek to the coop. She began to speak more, not of her past, never of that, but she would ask him about the ranch. She learned the names of his horses, the draft named Boulder and the buckskin named Rye. She learned that the cattle were shorthorn and that he was worried the spring melt would flood the lower pasture. She even, on a bright, clear afternoon, smiled. He had told a short, dry story about a coyote that had tried to steal a whole salted ham from his smokehouse the year before. The image of the animal, its jaws stretched, dragging the ham, struck her as absurd. A small, rusty sound bubbled up in her chest. It was a laugh, or the memory of one. His head snapped up. He stared at her, stunned. She blushed and looked away, the smile vanishing. But the ice had cracked, yet a part of her was always watching. She would stand on the small porch, her hand on the rough log wall, and stare at the horizon. The melting snow revealed the dark line of the hills, the pass that led back to the road, back to the world. The thaw was not a rescue. It was a threat. The white, howling storm had been her keeper, her protector. This bright, dripping world, full of sun and sound, was what she feared. The men in the wagon would be able to travel again. The snows receded, revealing the damage of the long winter. A section of his fence line on the north pasture had been flattened by the weight of the drifts. He rode Rye out to it, his tools in his saddlebag, and Clara watched him go. She sat on the porch, the mending basket in her lap, but her needle was still. She watched him work, a small, distant figure against the vast, pale brown of the plains. He returned late, his face grim, and spent the evening sharpening axe heads. The next day was warm, the sun a strange, welcome weight. The last of the snow was melting in dirty patches. Silas set off, this time on foot, the heavy maul over his shoulder. He was going to cut and set new posts. Clara found herself drawn to the edge of the porch, then to the yard, then, slowly, she walked out, following his tracks, until she could see him. She kept her distance, sitting on a dry boulder, the mending in her lap as a pretense. The work was brutal. He was splitting pine for the posts. He shed his coat, then his thick wool shirt. He worked in just his trousers and his undershirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his suspenders straining. The thunk of the maul hitting the wedge was a sharp, steady rhythm, the only sound in the vast quiet. She watched the muscles in his back and shoulders bunch and release, the wood splitting with a clean, sharp crack. He was a creature of power, of solid, grounded strength, but it was a different strength than she had ever known. It was not for hurting. It was for building. The sun rose higher. He paused, wiping his forehead with his arm. He looked at his undershirt, dark with sweat, and with a grunt of impatience. He pulled it off, tossing it onto his coat. Clara's breath caught. She had never seen a man's body bared for any reason but violence. He went back to work, his back to her. His skin was pale from the long winter, but the muscles were clear, defined by the hard, repetitive labor. He was not a soft man. He was a man made of wood and iron and earth. He moved with an economy of motion, his power controlled, focused on the task. She felt a strange heat rise in her, starting low in her belly and spreading up to her face. It was not fear. It was something else, something new and confusing and deeply, terribly alive. Her gaze lingered on the line of his spine, the stretch of his shoulders as he swung the maul. She felt flushed, her own skin suddenly too tight. She looked down at the sock in her hands, her fingers trembling, but her eyes were drawn back to him, to the simple, potent fact of him. That night, the tension was back in the cabin, but it was a different creature. It was no longer the brittle ice of fear. It was the hum of a plucked string. They ate their meal in silence, the air thick with what they had both seen, what they had both felt. They sat by the fire, she on her cot, he in his chair. He was cleaning his rifle, the lamplight glinting on the oiled metal. Clara stared into the flames. She was thinking of his hands, so large, swinging the maul. Then she thought of those same hands, so gentle, cutting the frozen rags from her feet. "I haven't been touched kindly in years." The words were out before she could stop them. They hung in the small, warm room, a terrible, dark weight. Silas's hand stilled on the rifle. He did not look at her. He waited. She was trembling, but she could not stop. The confession, held back for so long, was spilling over. "The men," she whispered, her voice raw. They didn't have a word for kind. They took everything, until I wasn't even a person anymore, just a thing to be used and sold." She wrapped her arms around herself, the blue wool a scant protection against the memory. Silas carefully set the rifle barrel on the table. He turned his chair to face her. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were alive, a dark, burning fire. He did not move toward her. He did not offer a hand. He knew, instinctively, that the space between them was her only safety. "I will never," he said, his voice low and vibrating with a resolve that shook her. "Take anything from you, Clara, not your work, not your words, not your body, nothing." She looked at him, her eyes wide, swimming with tears she refused to let fall. He leaned forward, his hands gripping his own knees. "But if you give," he said, the words a sacred vow in the quiet room, "if you ever choose to give anything, I'll hold it sacred." She searched his face, his hard, honest, angular face. He was not making a proposition. He was making a promise. He was giving her back the one thing that had been stolen. The choice, the next morning, the promise hung between them, as real as the smell of coffee. He was in the barn, mending a piece of harness, his brow furrowed in concentration. The leather was stiff and he was trying to thread a new buckle. Clara came in, her bucket full of feed for the hens. The barn was tight, the stalls narrow. To get to the coop, she had to pass him. She stopped, just behind his shoulder. He was focused on his work, his large fingers fumbling with the small, metal tongue of the buckle. You're doing it backward," she said, her voice hesitant. He grunted, frustrated. "I know. It won't catch." She set her bucket down. She stepped closer, into his space. He could smell the soap on her, the faint scent of wood smoke from her dress. She reached out. Her hand, small and scarred, brushed his forearm. "Here," she whispered. She did not touch the harness. She touched him, a fleeting, nervous brush of her fingers against his skin. He froze. The arm under her hand was granite. He did not breathe. Her fingers, trembling, went to the buckle. She turned it, guided the leather through, and seated the tongue with a small click. "Like that," she said. Her hand lingered on his arm for a half-second too long. Then, she pulled it back as if burned. She grabbed her bucket, her face crimson, and fled to the chicken coop, her heart hammering against her ribs. Silas did not move for a full minute. He stared at the harness, his skin tingling where she had touched him. It was the first time she had initiated contact. It was not an accident. It was an answer. The thaw was complete. The snow was gone, leaving behind a world of wet, brown earth and the pale, hopeful green of new grass. The creek behind the cabin was a roaring, swollen river. The air was soft, and as the world outside thawed, so did the walls inside. The glances were no longer just glances. They held. Her small, rusty smile appeared more often. He would find himself watching her as she read from the one book he owned, an old almanac, her lips moving silently. The desire that had sparked when she'd watched him by the fence line was no longer a spark. It was a low, steady ember, simmering beneath every shared meal, every quiet evening, every time their hands brushed as they passed in the small cabin. One afternoon, rummaging in his trunk for a new whetstone, Clara found it, tucked in the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a half-used bar of lye soap, scented faintly with lavender. It must have been Sarah's. She held it, the scent bringing a sharp, painful memory of a life she'd never had, a life of simple, clean things. She thought of the cold, greasy water in the wagon. She thought of the filth that seemed to be ground into her very skin. That evening, she waited until he was sitting by the fire, his boots off, his guard down. She held the soap out to him, her hands shaking. "Silas, I found this." She showed him the soap. I was wondering, if it's not too much trouble, might I bathe?" The request was so simple, so human. It stopped him. He looked at her, at the flush on her cheeks, the desperate hope in her eyes. She wanted to be clean. He nodded, his face softening. "Aye," he said. "Of course." He didn't make a fuss. He didn't treat it as strange. He treated it as a chore, a task. He hung his thickest blanket from a rope stretched across the far corner of the cabin, creating a small, private space. He hauled the tin bathtub from the shed, setting it behind the screen. He filled the big kettle and several pots and set them on the stove to heat. When the water was hot, he poured it into the tub, then added cold water from the bucket until it was steaming. He left the soap and a clean, rough towel on a stool. "I'll be in the barn," he said, his voice practical. "Mending that harness, right?" He put on his coat and hat. "Take your time. The fire is high. It will stay warm." He left. Clara stood, listening to his footsteps fade. She was alone. She stepped behind the blanket screen. The tub was deep, the water steaming. It was the greatest luxury she had ever known. She undressed, the blue wool dress falling to the floor. She looked down at her own body. It was thin, scarred, her ribs stark. It was a stranger's body. She stepped into the water and sank down. The heat was a shock, a profound, aching relief that made her gasp. She took the soap, the beautiful, lavender-scented soap, and she began to wash. She washed her hair, scrubbing at her scalp, the suds thick and white. She washed her arms, her legs, her stomach. She scrubbed at the dirt, at the memory. But the feeling of her own hands on her own skin brought it all back. She remembered Hendry's hands, his thick fingers pinching her, testing her. She remembered the saloon keeper, his wet, heavy hand on her arm. She remembered the dull-witted boy, Jeb, his fumbling, clumsy grabs in the dark. The soap was no longer cleansing. It was a trigger. The water was no longer warm. It was a violation. The memories overwhelmed her. A black, oily tide. She sank down, curling into herself. Her arms wrapped around her knees, her forehead pressed to her shins. She sat in the cooling water and cried, silent. Racking sobs that shook her frame, the lavender soap dissolving, forgotten, in the gray water. He found her an hour later. Not in the tub. She was dressed again, her hair still damp and tangled, sitting on the bearskin rug, staring into a fire that had burned low. She was shivering, wrapped in a blanket, but the cold was inside her. He knew instantly that the bath had not been a comfort. It had been a trial. He did not ask what was wrong. He simply added wood to the fire, stoking it until it roared back to life. He poured 2 cups of coffee, leaving hers on the hearth. He sat in his chair, the silence stretching. Finally, she spoke, her voice a dead, hollow whisper. "Would you still look at me if I was broken?" He stopped, the cup halfway to his lips. He looked at her, a small, hunched figure, her face in shadow. "Would you?" she pressed, her voice cracking. "If you knew, if you saw, if all the pieces don't fit right anymore, would you still—" "Look at me?" Silas set his cup down. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze steady, unflinching. He saw her, the scars on her feet, the shadow in her eyes, the way her hands trembled. He saw the girl in the hay, and the woman who had mended his socks, and the friend who had sat with him by the fire. "You're not broken, Clara," he said, his voice rough but absolute. "Broken things. They're gone. They're scattered. They're dust." He motioned to her, a short, sharp nod of his head. "You're still here. You're still sitting here. You walked through hell, and you're still standing." She looked up, her eyes wide, searching his. He was not lying to be kind. He was giving her a truth she could not see. Survival was not brokenness. It was strength. The emotional rawness in the room was a tangible thing, a weight on the air. He felt, for the first time, not pity, not a sense of duty, but a deep, profound, and aching tenderness for this woman. He moved from his chair. He knelt on the rug in front of her. He did not touch her. He just knelt, bringing himself to her level. She looked at him, her lips parted, her breath shallow. He was so close. She could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the rough stubble on his jaw. He was not smiling. He was just watching her, waiting. She was the one who moved. A tiny, almost imperceptible lean forward. A question. He met her. He leaned in, slowly, and pressed his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of profound, shattering tenderness. It was tentative. It was slow. It was the first gentle touch she had received in a lifetime. His lips were chapped, warm, and they tasted faintly of coffee and wood smoke. It was a kiss of shared grief, of unspoken promises, of two solitudes touching for the first time. Clara's hands, which had been clenched in her lap, rose. They trembled violently. They hovered, unsure, in the air between them. Then they settled on his shoulders, clutching his shirt as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. She did not pull away. She leaned into him, and for the first time, she kissed him back. When he finally drew away, they were both breathing as if they had run a mile. Her eyes were closed, and a single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. He did not wipe it away. He just watched her. That night, the cabin was colder than it had been during the storm. A deep, bone-chilling cold had set in. Clara lay on her cot, the quilt pulled to her chin, but she was shivering. The cot was an island. It was small, and it was lonely. Across the room, Silas was in his own bed. He lay on his back, his arms crossed over his chest, staring at the dark ceiling. The kiss had changed everything. The promise he had made, "I'll hold it sacred," was thudding in his chest with every beat of his heart. She heard him shift, the ropes of his bed creaking. She could not stay on the cot. She was not afraid of him. For the first time, she was afraid of the cold. She was afraid of the nightmares that waited in the dark. She sat up, clutching her quilt. She stood, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. She walked the few steps to his bed. He was awake. She could see the faint glint of his eyes in the moonlight. He did not speak. He did not ask what she wanted. He simply moved over, his large frame shifting to one side, and lifted the edge of his heavy blankets. It was an invitation, a silent, steady offer. She climbed in, still in the blue wool dress. She brought her own quilt with her, piling it on top. She lay on her back, stiff as a board, her shoulders not quite touching his. The space between them was electric. They lay in the dark, two separate, rigid lines. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of their breathing. And then She heard it. His heartbeat. It was not slow and steady, it was thudding. Thud, 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 thud. It was fast and hard, and she realized, with a jolt, that it was thudding just as loud, just as fast, as her own. He was not calm, he was not relaxed, he was as nervous, as uncertain, as she was. A small, shaky breath escaped her. She shifted, just an inch, and her shoulder brushed his. He did not pull away. They lay there, side by side, fully clothed, as the fire burned down to embers. They did not speak. They did not touch again. They just lay in the dark. Two people, no longer alone, their hearts beating a matched, frantic rhythm against the vast, cold silence. Lying in the dark, his solid warmth a barrier against the cold, had changed the world. Clara had woken before him, her heart calm for the first time she could remember. She had slipped from the bed, his breathing deep and even, and had built the fire herself. She was no longer a ghost in his house, or a guest. She was a presence. They had eaten breakfast in their new, charged silence. The kiss had been a question, and sharing his bed, even in that chaste, terrified way, had been an answer. But it was an answer that led to more questions. They worked together that day, clearing the winter's debris from the small yard. He was splitting the last of a fallen pine, and she was gathering the chips in a bucket for kindling. The work was simple, physical, a rhythm they fell into. "He was a good man," she said, her voice quiet, directed at the pile of wood chips. Silas stopped, the maul resting on the block. He knew, without asking, who she meant. "Your father." "He was," she insisted, her voice fierce, as if defending him. The winters were too hard, and the whiskey was too easy. He had a cough, deep in his chest. It never left him after my mother passed." She knelt, her hands sorting the wood, her gaze distant. "He borrowed money from a man named Hendry, a trader, he called himself. He came through once a season. My father, he thought he could pay it back with the spring pelts, but the cough took him. He died in his chair, and I was the debt." Silas's hands tightened on the handle of the maul. He could feel the grain of the wood bite into his palms. He said nothing, his face a mask of stone. He just let her talk. "Hendry came 2 days after we buried him. He didn't even knock. He just walked in. He looked at me, and he looked at the empty shelves, and he said, 'Well, girl, your papa's account is due. I was 17. She stood up, her bucket full, but she made no move to take it to the cabin. She was looking at the horizon, at the road she could not see. He traded in everything: whiskey, guns, furs, and women. He had 3 others in the wagon. We were headed to Cheyenne. He said a girl with spirit, even a scrawny one, would fetch a high price at a brothel there. They liked to be the ones to break them." Silas's jaw locked so hard a muscle jumped. He wanted to hit something. He wanted to split the entire world in two. He kept his voice perfectly level. "How did you get away?" He was careless. We'd been on the road for a month. He'd stopped at some small outpost, trying to sell me to a saloon keeper. The man said I was too much trouble, not worth the price. Hendry was angry. He was drinking. He left a new boy, Jeb, to guard the wagon. But Jeb drank, too. He fell asleep. I slipped out the back. I didn't take anything. I just ran. I ran into the snow." She wrapped her arms around herself, the blue wool dress a thin comfort against the memory. "I heard them shouting, but the wind was so loud, I hid, and I walked, and then I found your barn." She finally looked at him, her eyes wide, searching his. She expected to see pity. She expected to see disgust. She saw rage. It was not a hot, loud rage. It was a cold, quiet, terrifying rage, banked deep in his eyes. He looked like a man who was capable of killing, and for the first time, the thought of that violence did not make her afraid. It made her feel, impossibly, safe. He stepped past her, picked up the axe, and swung it. The log exploded, the two halves flying apart. He swung again, And again, his breaths coming in sharp, controlled grunts, the chips flying. He was working out the violence, taming it, when the block was nothing but firewood. He stopped, his chest heaving. He wiped his face on his sleeve and turned to her. "No man," he said, his voice low and absolute, "will ever own you again. Clara, I swear it, no man." The vow settled between them, as solid as the mountains on the horizon. It was a promise of a new life. 3 days passed. The promise held. The world was soft with spring. Clara was feeding the hens, scattering the grain, her movements light. She was humming, a small, tuneless sound she hadn't realized she'd remembered. And then she saw it, a rider, on the high ridge to the east, a black silhouette against the bright morning sky. It was not a neighbor. He was moving too slow, too purposeful. He was scanning the valley. He was scanning their ranch. A cold stone dropped into her stomach. She told herself it was just a traveler, a lost cowhand. Then the man turned his horse, and the sunlight caught the brand on the animal's flank. It was a double H, lazy, enclosed in a circle. Hendry's brand. Clara dropped the feed bucket, the grain scattered, the hens clucking in protest. She did not breathe. She was frozen, her mind a white, screaming blank. "Clara!" Silas's voice, sharp and urgent, snapped her back. He was running from the barn, his rifle in his hand. He had seen the rider, too. "Inside, now," he commanded. She couldn't move. "Silas," she whispered, her voice choking. "The brand, it's his." His face went hard. He didn't waste a second. He grabbed her arm, his grip bruising, and half dragged her to the cabin. "The root cellar," he said. The cellar was a small, dark hole under the floorboards, hidden beneath the bearskin rug. It smelled of damp earth and potatoes. It was where he had stored his supplies for the winter. "Get in," he said, pulling back the rug and the heavy door. "No," she pleaded. "Silas, he'll hurt you. He has men. Get in, Clara!" he roared, a sound she had never heard from him. It was the roar of pure, protective fear. She stumbled down the short ladder, into the dark. He looked down at her, his face a grim shadow. "Stay here. Do not make a sound. Do not come out. No matter what you hear, do you understand me?" She nodded, her hands over her mouth. He slammed the door, the sound final. She heard the scrape of the bearskin rug being dragged back into place. And then, silence. She was alone in the dark, with the smell of earth and her own terror. Silas stood in the center of the cabin, his rifle held loosely in his hand, his thumb on the hammer. He waited. He heard the slow, steady hoofbeats approach, stop outside, heard the creak of leather as the man dismounted. A knock, sharp, confident. Silas walked to the door and opened it. The man was not Hendry. He was younger, with a mean, narrow face and eyes that were too close together. It was the boy from her memory, Jeb. He was older now, harder. His hand was resting on the butt of his pistol. "Mornin'," Jeb said, his eyes scanning the inside of the cabin, lingering on the table set for two, the cot in the corner, the trunk. "Afternoon," Silas said, his voice flat. He did not move. He filled the doorway. "What do you want?" Jeb's gaze settled on Silas's rifle. He gave a thin, wet smile. "Just checking the line. Lost a few head of stock in the storm. Heard a rumor someone might have found something that didn't belong to him." "I haven't seen any stray cattle," Silas said. "Just my own. Cattle," Jeb said, drawing the word out. He spat a stream of tobacco juice, missing Silas's boot by an inch. "Yeah, cattle. Ain't seen. Anything else? Stray? Something. Small, maybe. Got away from us up near the pass. Oh, about 4, maybe 5 months back, just before the big snow." "I've seen no one," Silas said. "The storm was bad. No one came through here." Jeb leaned against the door frame, trying to look past Silas. "Funny. Found a set of tracks. Small, bare feet. Looked like near the creek bed. About a mile from here. Tracks were headed this way. Then the snow hit. We figured, whatever it was, the wolves got. But Hendry, he likes to be thorough." His eyes flicked to the blue wool dress hanging on a peg to dry, where Clara had washed it that morning. It was Sarah's, but it was a woman's dress. Jeb's smile widened. "You all alone out here, old man?" "I am," Silas said. His voice was quiet. His thumb had not moved from the hammer of his rifle. "Pity," Jeb said. "Gets lonely. Well, if you see anything, you let us know. Hendry's camp is over on the Sweetwater. He pays good for lost property." He lingered, his eyes making one last hungry sweep of the cabin. Silas did not move. He was a mountain. He was death waiting. Jeb seemed to sense it. His smile faltered. He pushed himself off the doorframe. "You have a good day, then," he said. He walked back to his horse, his spurs dragging in the dirt. He mounted, his movement slow, arrogant. He looked back at the cabin one last time. "We'll be seeing you," he called out. It was not a farewell. It was a threat. He wheeled his horse and trotted away, back toward the ridge. Silas did not move. He watched until the rider was a speck, until he had vanished over the ridge. He stood in the doorway for 5 more minutes, scanning the horizon. Only then did he bar the door, his movements heavy. He moved the rug. He opened the cellar door. Clara was huddled at the bottom of the ladder, her body shaking so badly she could barely stand. He went down into the dark and put his hands on her shoulders. "He's gone," he said. She collapsed against him, her sobs dry, painful, tearing from her throat. He lifted her as he had that first day, carrying her out of the dark, and set her on the chair by the cold hearth. That night, the fear was a poison in the cabin. Clara had not spoken since he'd pulled her from the cellar. She sat on her cot, her arms wrapped around her knees, rocking, her eyes wide and blank, seeing things he could not. "He knew," she finally whispered, her voice dead. "He saw my dress. He knew." "It was Sarah's dress," Silas said, but his voice lacked conviction. The man had seen a dress. It was enough. "They'll find me," she rocked, her voice a low, rhythmic moan of despair. "They always do. They'll come back. They'll come back. And they'll take me. And they'll hurt you for hiding me." "Clara." He knelt in front of her, as he had the night of the kiss. He tried to take her hands, but she snatched them away, clutching them to her chest. "They always find me," she wept, the tears finally coming, hot and fast. I can't go back. I won't." "Listen to me," Silas said, his voice sharp, trying to cut through her panic. He grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "He's gone. For now." "He'll be back," she shrieked, her control shattering. "They'll be back tonight, with Hendry. He'll—" "Oh, God, Silas, you don't know him?" "Then let them come," Silas said, his voice a low, hard growl. He shook her, gently. "Do you hear me? Let them come!" She stopped, her mouth open. A sob caught in her throat. She stared at him. "This is my land," he said, his eyes burning into hers. "This is my home. You are in my home. If they want you, they'll have to go through me." The finality of it, the simple, brutal truth of it, silenced her. He was not just offering comfort. He was offering his life. He was a wall. He was the man with the rifle, the man who filled the doorway. She looked at him, truly saw him, the solid set of his jaw, the promise in his dark eyes. He would die before he let them take her. The terror in her receded, beaten back by the sheer, unyielding force of his will. And in its place, something new bloomed, something warm and fierce and aching. "I want to be yours," she whispered, the words so quiet he almost didn't hear them. He went still. "Clara." "No," she said, her voice stronger. She put her trembling fingers on his lips, silencing him. Not because I'm scared. Not because you're protecting me, not as payment." She choked on the word. I don't I don't want to trade one master for another, even a kind one. He understood. He understood completely. He pulled back, giving her space. I know, he said, his voice thick. I told you, I will never take— I know, she said. She slid off the cot, standing in front of him. She was still trembling, but her eyes were steady. But I want to give. She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. I'm ready, she said. Not because of them, because of you. He stood up, his heart a heavy, painful drum against his ribs. He was afraid to move. He was afraid to breathe. She was the one who acted. She was the one who had to make the choice. Slowly, her hands shaking so badly she fumbled with the buttons. She began to undress. She unfastened the high collar of Sarah's blue dress. She shrugged it off her shoulders, letting it fall to a pool of dark wool at her feet. She stood before him in her thin, mended chemise. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and she untied the ribbon, letting the chemise fall. She stood before him, bathed in the soft, flickering light of the lamp. She was thin. Her ribs were a pale ladder under her skin, and her body was a map of her past, a long, puckered scar on her ribs, from a mule's kick. She had told him once, faint, silvery lines on her thighs, a cluster of small, round scars on her shoulder that looked like— He forced himself not to look too closely, not to let the rage consume him. She was trembling from head to foot, her arms half-crossed, trying to cover herself. She was terrified, but she did not move. She was offering him all of it, the good, the bad, the broken. Silas felt a profound aching reverence fill his chest. This was not desire. It was something holy. It was the trust of a creature that had never known trust. He did not reach for her body. He stepped forward and cupped her face, his large, rough hands gentle on her skin. He tilted her head up, forcing her to meet his eyes. I see you, he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. Clara, I see all of you. She closed her eyes, a single tear escaping, tracing a path down her cheek. And you're safe, he said. He kissed her. He kissed her forehead. He kissed her eyelids. He kissed the tear from her cheek. He kissed her lips. And this time, it was not the tentative, questioning kiss of the hearth. It was a promise. It was a claiming. He lifted her, her skin cold against his warm shirt, and carried her to his bed. He laid her down and covered her with the blankets. He undressed himself in the shadows and slid in beside her. He did not take her. He did not prove his strength. He held her. He wrapped his body around hers, pulling her back against his chest, his arms a secure, warm cage. He pressed his face into her hair, which still smelled faintly of lavender, and he just held her. At first, she was rigid, a coiled spring of tension. He just held her, his breathing steady, his heart thudding against her back. He whispered to her, not words, just sounds of comfort, the same sounds he used to gentle a spooked horse. And slowly, piece by piece, the tension left her. She began to cry, not the sobs of terror, not the screams of her nightmares. It was a quiet, profound weeping, a release of all the pain, all the fear, all the years of being a thing. She cried for the girl she had been, and for the woman she was becoming. He held her through all of it, his hand stroking her hair, his lips pressed to her temple. When the tears finally subsided, she was boneless, exhausted, and empty. She turned in his arms, her small, scarred body fitting against his. Her hand came to rest on his chest, her fingers splayed over his heart. Their union, when it came, was not a fire. It was a thaw. It was as slow and as quiet and as inevitable as the melting of the snow. It was a reverence. It was two broken, solitary pieces, fitting together, finding a way to be whole. It was a long time later when he felt her stir. He looked down. Her face, in the soft, flickering light of the dying fire, was calm. Her eyes were open. She was looking at him, a small, sleepy, wondering smile on her lips. He brushed the damp hair from her forehead. You all right? he whispered. She nodded, pressing her face into his shoulder. I'm not afraid, she said, her voice muffled. He held her tighter. I know. They lay like that, tangled and calm, their limbs intertwined, their breathing finally in sync. The fire burned down to red embers, casting a faint, warm glow over the room. Outside, the night was vast and silent. But inside the cabin, there was no fear. There was only the slow, steady beat of two hearts, finally at peace. The world, which had been buried in a silent, blinding white, was reborn in a rush of noise and mud. Spring did not arrive in Wyoming. It attacked, tearing the snow from the hills and sending it down the ravines in roaring, brown torrents. The creek behind the cabin, which had been a frozen, silent line, became a raging, small river. The sky, which had been a low, gray ceiling, was now impossibly high, a sharp, aching blue. The thaw was a release, but it was not a relief. The snowstorm had been a prison, but it had also been a fortress, a white wall that had kept the world at bay. Now, the world was back. The danger of freezing to death was gone, replaced by the much sharper, much more immediate threat of men. Silas knew it. Clara felt it in her bones. The isolation that had forged their bond was over. Now, they had to survive what came next. The morning after Hendry's man had come and gone. Silas did not go to mend the fences. He did not go to the barn. He walked to the gun rack, took down his heavy Winchester rifle, and laid it on the table. He took down the box of cartridges. Clara, washing their breakfast plates, went still. You've never shot one, he said. It was not a question. No, she whispered. I don't like them. The sound. It's not about liking, Silas said, his voice flat. He picked up the rifle and held it out to her. But first, it's about living. You need to know how to use this. You need to know how to make it a part of you. She looked at the dark, oiled wood, the cold, blue-black steel. It was a thing of death. It was the sound of Hendry, of Jeb, of men who took what they wanted. Take it. She wiped her hands, her heart a cold stone in her chest, and took the rifle. The weight of it shocked her. It was heavier than she had imagined, a solid, brutal thing. Out, he said. He took her 100 yards from the cabin, near the creek bed, and set up a row of tin cans on a fallen log. He was a patient, demanding teacher. He had the same focus he brought to splitting wood or mending tack. Hold it right, he said, his voice practical. He adjusted her stance, his hands on her shoulders, moving her as if she were a piece of equipment. Not against your shoulder, into your shoulder. Hold it tight. If it's loose, it'll break your collarbone. You have to mean it. She was trembling. He stepped back. Now, she closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The explosion was a physical blow. The rifle slammed into her shoulder. A brutal, punishing kick. And the noise of it, a sharp, deafening crack, made her scream. She dropped the rifle in the mud. She stood, shaking, her shoulder throbbing, her ears ringing, tears of shock and fear blurring her vision. Silas said nothing. He walked over, picked up the rifle, wiped the mud from it on his trousers, and checked the action. He levered another cartridge into the chamber. He held it out to her again. You dropped it, he said. Never drop it. This is your life. You pick it up, or you die. I can't, she cried, the tears spilling over. It's horrible. Aye, he said, his face hard. It is. So is Hendry. So is Jeb. So is the world. Pick it up. Clara. She stared at him, at the unyielding set of his jaw. He was not being cruel. He was being honest. He was showing her the truth she had been running from. She took a shuddering breath, wiped the tears from her face with her sleeve, and took the rifle. Her shoulder ached, her ears rang. Again, he said. She learned to hold it tight, to lean into the kick, to become one with the violence of the tool. She learned to breathe, to squeeze the trigger, not jerk it. She learned to keep her eyes open, to face the explosion. It was 2 days before she hit one of the cans. The ping of the bullet striking the tin was the most satisfying sound she had ever heard. It was a sound of control. She lowered the rifle, her shoulder a mass of purple bruises. But she was not shaking. A small, cold smile touched her lips. Silas nodded, a brief spark of approval in his eyes. "Good," he said. "Again." He taught her more than the rifle. He taught her the horses. She had only ever been a passenger, a piece of cargo, on a horse. He put her on Rye, the buckskin, and taught her to ride. "You're not on him," he'd call, as she wobbled in the saddle. "You're with him. Feel him. He knows what you're thinking. If you're scared, he's scared. You have to be the boss. You have to tell him where you're going." She learned to feel the rhythm of the horse, to use her legs, her balance. It was a partnership, a different kind of power than the rifle. The rifle was control over death. The horse was control over life. It was escape. It was freedom. One afternoon, he had her riding in the north pasture. "Where to?" she asked. "As fast as he'll go." Silas said, "Go." She hesitated, and then, remembering the feeling of the rifle, the commitment, she dug her heels in. Rye leaped forward, from a trot to a canter to a full, pounding gallop. The world dissolved into a blur of brown earth and blue sky. The wind tore at her hair, ripping it from the bun she'd put it in. It was terrifying. It was glorious. She was flying. She rode him to the ridge and back, pulling him up in a spray of dirt, her face flushed, her eyes bright and alive, her hair a wild tangle. Silas watched her, his heart aching with a fierce, painful pride. This was not the ghost he had found in the hay. This was a woman. She was stronger. The weeks of hard work, of good food, of sleep without terror, had put meat on her bones. The blue wool dress, which had hung on her, now fit her. She walked with her head up. Her voice, which had been a whisper, was now clear and steady. She had claimed the cabin. She had planted a small row of wild herbs she'd found by the creek. She had mended all his clothes, and had even, in a fit of determined housekeeping, scrubbed the pine floors until they were pale and clean. She was building a home, a life, a nest. But the trauma was a shadow that lingered, a fox that stalked the edges of her newfound confidence. She had grown accustomed to the sounds of the ranch, the sounds of Silas, but a sudden, unexpected noise, a log dropping on the woodpile, the slam of the barn door in a gust of wind would make her jump, her hand flying to her throat, her eyes wide, the hunted look returning. He would see it. He would just stop what he was doing and stand still. He would not rush to her. He would not coddle her. He would just be there, a solid, unmoving presence, until her heart stopped pounding. "Just the wind," she would say, her voice shaky. "Aye," he would answer, and go back to his work. The new, open world required supplies. The winter had been long. Their stores were low. They were out of salt, out of flour, and, most importantly, they were low on ammunition. Silas could not put it off any longer. He had to go to the settlement, Sweetwater Crossing, a full day's ride. "You're coming with me," he said, his mind made up. "No," Clara said, and the force of her refusal surprised him. "No, I can't. Not yet. Not where there are other people. And besides," she said, her voice gaining strength, "who will watch the ranch? What if they come back and we're both gone? No, you go. I'll stay. I have the rifle. I have Rye, saddled in the barn. I can ride to the high rocks, where you showed me. I can be safe." He looked at her. She was right. It was smarter for one of them to stay. But the thought of leaving her, even for a day, made his gut twist. "I don't like it," he said. "I don't like you going," she countered, her gaze steady. "But we need salt." He left before dawn. She stood on the porch, the heavy rifle in her hands, and watched him ride away. A small, dark figure against the graying east. The moment he disappeared over the ridge, the silence of the ranch became a heavy, terrifying thing. She spent the entire day on the porch, the rifle across her lap, her eyes scanning the horizon. Silas rode hard. Sweetwater Crossing was not a town. It was a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and 24 houses huddled by the river. He tied Rye to the hitching post outside Peters's general store. The place was empty, save for old man Peters himself. "Silas," Peters said, his voice quiet. "Been a long time. Thought the storm might have taken you." "It was a bad one," Silas said, laying his list on the counter. "Need flour, salt, coffee, and cartridges. For the Winchester." Peters began to gather the items, his movements slow. You had a good winter then? Stayed warm?" Silas's eyes narrowed. "Warm enough." The bell on the store door jangled. 3 men came in, their spurs loud on the wood floor. They were from one of the big ranches to the south. They stopped when they saw Silas. "Merrick," one of them said. Nodding, Silas nodded back. "Heard you ain't so lonely up on that ridge anymore." "Silas," the man said, his voice too loud in the small store. Silas turned, his face unreadable. "I'm not a lonely man." "No," the man chuckled. "Heard that, too. Heard a fella named Hendry was through the saloon last week, asking questions, talking about lost property." The store went silent. Old man Peters froze, his hand on a sack of flour. "Hendry," another of the men said, spitting tobacco juice into the cracker barrel, "was offering a reward, $50, for a runaway girl. Said she was feeble-minded and dangerous. Said she stole from him $50. It was a fortune. It was enough to make a man search, to make a man talk." Silas laid his money on the counter, his movements stiff. "Just the supplies. Peters." Peters finished sacking the goods, his hands shaking. Silas took the heavy sacks. His eyes meeting the other men's, they were curious. Not yet hostile, but the poison was in the well. The rumor was out. He rode back, his heels digging into Rye's flanks, a cold fury in his heart. He found Clara on the porch, her face pale, the rifle still across her lap. She saw his face as he dismounted, and she knew. "What is it?" "Word's out," he said, uncinching the saddle, his movements sharp, angry. "Hendry was in the settlement. He's put a bounty on you, $50, says you're his property. Stolen!" Clara's face went white. The blood drained from it, leaving her looking like the ghost he had first found. $50. It was a death warrant. Someone will, for that much money." "Aye," he said. He threw the saddle over the rail. She looked at him, her newfound strength, her confidence, all of it, crumbling. She was the one who had brought this. She was a plague. She was going to be the death of this good, quiet man. "I have to go," she whispered, the words tearing from her. "We're not having this talk again." "Clara." "No, you don't understand," she said, her voice rising, thick with a new, frantic energy. It's not just about me. It's you. They'll come for me. And you'll be here. They'll kill you. Silas. For me. For a thing. A piece of property." She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in. "I'm not worth your life. I'm not worth this ranch." "Stop it," he said, his voice a low growl. "No!" She was crying now, the tears of guilt and terror hot on her cheeks. "I'll leave. Tonight. You can't stop me. I'll ride west. You taught me how. I'll take my chances. You can tell them I was never here." He grabbed her, his hands on her shoulders, and shook her. Once. Hard. "And you think that will save me?" he roared, his own control snapping. "You think they'll believe me? You think Hendry is a man who just gives up? They'll come here, and you'll be gone. And they'll take their $50 out of my hide. They'll burn this place to the ground just for the trouble." He pulled her closer, his face inches from hers, his eyes burning. You think this is about the ranch? You think this is about my life?" He let go of her, shoving her back a step. He was breathing hard, his hands clenched. He paced away, running his hands through his hair. He looked, for the first time, truly afraid. "I didn't save you to lose you now," he said, his voice raw, his back to her. I didn't just save you. You saved me!" She stopped, the tears frozen on her face. He turned, his face ravaged, the mask of the stoic rancher gone. "This place was a grave," he said, his voice thick. "I was a ghost. I was just waiting to die. And then you came. You brought this house back to life. You brought me back." He walked to her, his movements slow. He cupped her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "You're not leaving. This isn't your fight. Clara, it's our fight. Your life, my life, this ranch. It's all one thing now. We stand, or we run, but we do it, together." She leaned into his hands, her own coming up to cover his. She had never known this. She had never known a man who would not just die for her, but live for her, who would claim her, not as property, but as a part. "Together," she whispered. It was 3 days later, a clear, high plains morning. The sky a painful, cloudless blue. The air was cool, smelling of pine and damp earth. Clara was at the chicken coop, scattering grain. It was so peaceful, so normal. That was when she heard them. The sound of horses. Not one, more than one, coming from the east ridge. Her heart stopped. She did not scream. She did not run. The training, the new hard core of her, took over. She dropped the grain and ran, fast, silent, to the cabin. "Silas!" she yelled, bursting through the door. He was at the table, cleaning the rifle. He looked up, his eyes sharp. "How many?" "I don't know," she panted. "More than one. From the east." He was on his feet, grabbing the cartridge box. He moved to the door and looked. He was calm. "3," he said. His voice was flat. "It's them. I see Hendry's gray." The world seemed to slow down. The sound of the spring peepers by the creek suddenly seemed deafening. "Clara," he said, his voice all business. "The cellar." "No," she said, her hands balling into fists. "I'm not hiding." "The hell you're not," he snarled. "This is not a fight you can win. It's a fight I can. You hide. That's the plan. Silas, now," he roared. He grabbed her, pulling her to the rug, and threw back the cellar door. "Get in." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "I am not losing you," he said, his voice low, fierce. "Get in, bar it from the inside, and take this." He shoved his own skinning knife, in its sheath, into her hand. If I am not the one who opens that door, you know what to do." She looked at the knife. She looked at his face. She nodded. She climbed down into the damp, potato-smelling dark. He slammed the door. She heard the scrape of the rug. She was alone. Silas picked up his rifle. He levered a shell into the chamber. He checked the pistol at his hip. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out onto the porch. He stood there, his rifle held loosely at his side, and waited. They rode into the yard, Hendry in the lead, on his tall gray. He was an older man, 50 maybe, with a thick graying beard and cold blue eyes. To his right was Jeb, his thin face split in a nervous, excited grin. To his left was a third man, a stranger, big and heavy-set, with a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. They stopped, a dozen yards from the porch. "Silas Merrick," Hendry called out, his voice reasonable, like a man discussing the weather. Silas just watched him. "You're a hard man to find, and a stubborn one." "I hear," Hendry said. He stroked his horse's neck. "I'm here for my property." "The girl?" "There's no property here," Silas said, his voice level. "Just a woman. And she's not yours." Hendry sighed, a theatrical, put-upon sound. "Mr. Merrick, I have a bill of sale, signed and dated, from her PA. That makes her mine. You are harboring a thief, a runaway. That's a serious crime in this territory." "She's no one's," Silas said. "Is that so?" Hendry smiled, a cold, thin smile. "Jeb, go check the cabin. Gently." Jeb's grin widened. He started to dismount. Silas raised the rifle, not to his shoulder, but the muzzle coming up, pointed at Jeb's chest. "You take one more step," Silas said, his voice a low, deadly rumble. "And I'll kill you before you hit the ground. Then I'll kill the big one. And then, Hendry, I'll kill you." The yard was absolutely silent. Jeb froze, his hand on the saddle horn. The big man shifted, his shotgun moving. "You're one man," Hendry said, his voice losing its reasonable tone. "We're three." "But I'm the one who's right," Silas said. "And I'm the one on my own land." Hendry looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw a man who had already died once, a man with absolutely nothing left to lose, except for what was in that cabin. He saw a man who would not back down. "This is foolish," Hendry snarled. We'll burn you out." "Then you'd better start," Silas said. The cabin door opened. Everyone froze. Silas's heart stopped. Clara stepped out onto the porch. She was in the blue wool dress. Her hair was loose. She was holding Silas's other rifle, the heavy Sharps buffalo gun, the one he had never taught her to shoot. It was almost as tall as she was, but she held it steady, the barrel pointed, not at any one man, but at all of them. "Clara," Silas breathed, his blood running cold. "I told you," she said, her voice clear, ringing in the morning air. "I'm no one's—" Hendry stared, his mouth open. He looked from this pale, fierce woman to Silas, and he understood. He had been tricked. He had been played. This was not a runaway. This was a rebellion. You ungrateful bitch," Jeb screamed, his nerve breaking. "After all Hendry did for you." He raised his pistol. Clara did not flinch. She did not look at Jeb. She kept her eyes on Hendry. She pulled the hammer back on the big rifle, a loud, heavy click, and she fired. The boom of the buffalo gun was a physical thing, a cannon shot that slammed into their chests. The sound echoed, rolling across the valley. The bullet, the size of a man's thumb, smashed into the porch post, not 3 inches from Hendry's head, exploding the wood into a cloud of splinters. The gray horse screamed and reared, almost throwing Hendry. The big man's shotgun went off, firing a blast of pellets harmlessly into the sky. Jeb yelped and fell off his horse. Clara stood, the rifle smoking, and began, with clumsy, shaking, but deliberate hands, to reload. Hendry fought his horse, his face white with shock and rage. He looked at Silas, who had not moved, his rifle still steady. He looked at Clara, who had the new, huge cartridge in her hand. He was a businessman. This was not a good investment. "This ain't over," he screamed, his voice cracking. He yanked his horse's head around. "This ain't over, you hear me?" Jeb scrambled onto his horse, his face pale. The big man was already riding. Hendry kicked his gray, and the 3 of them galloped out of the yard, fast, not looking back. Silas and Clara stood on the porch, watching them go. They watched until they were just small, dark specks, until they had vanished over the ridge. The rifle, the heavy, smoking Sharps, slipped from Clara's fingers, clattering to the wooden boards. Her knees gave out. She didn't fall. She just sat hard on the porch, her hands in her lap. Silas's rifle lowered. His hands were shaking. He realized he was shaking all over. He put the rifle down, leaning it against the wall. He sat on the porch step, not next to her, but near her. He put his head in his hands, his shoulders trembling with the aftermath, the adrenaline, the sheer, blinding relief. They sat like that for a long time, in the morning sun, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air, the only sound the distant, indignant clucking of the hens. That night, they sat on the porch again. The silence of the world had returned, but it was a different silence. It was not peace. It was a ceasefire. The crickets and the peepers by the creek sounded too loud, as if trying to cover the new, dark hole in the world. Clara was wrapped in a quilt, though the night was not cold. Silas was staring out at the hills, now black against a starry sky. "They'll be back," she said, her voice small. "Dead." It was not a question. "Aye," Silas said, his voice heavy. "Or they'll send the law, a marshal. With that piece of paper, Henry won't come at me again. He'll come at the law. And the law. It's on his side. A bill of sale is a bill of sale. They sat in the dark. This place, this small cabin, this patch of earth. It was his home. It was the only home she had ever known. And it was poisoned. "I'm sorry," she whispered, a tear tracking down her cheek. I ruined this for you. This is your father's home." He was silent for a long time. He looked at the fences he had mended, the barn he had built, the grave on the hill he hadn't visited in a year. He looked at the woman beside him, the woman who had faced down 3 armed men, the woman who had brought him back from the dead. He stood up and held out his hand. She looked at it, confused. "You didn't ruin anything," he said, his voice rough. You just showed me what's real." She took his hand. He pulled her to her feet. "A home," he said, it's not wood, it's not dirt, it's just a place to be safe." He looked out at the dark hills. "And this ain't safe, not anymore." He turned, his hands finding her waist. "You told me once you were ready to leave, to ride west. I wasn't, now I am." Her eyes widened. "Silas, your ranch." "It's just land," he said, and he was surprised to find that he meant it. He looked at her, at the strength, the fire, the life in her. "We'll build a new life," he said, the words a promise, a new vow. "Out there, Oregon, maybe, or California, someplace west. A place where no one knows our names." She leaned her forehead against his chest, her arms wrapping around his waist, holding on tight. "Together," she whispered. "Together," he said, and he held her, the two of them standing as one, under the vast Wyoming stars. It took 2 days, 2 frantic, hard-riding days where Silas moved with a grim, desperate energy. He rode south, not to Sweetwater, but to a neighboring ranch 20 miles distant, run by an old, hard-bitten man named Eli Pope. Eli was a man who minded his own business and who hated Henry's kind more than he valued a dollar. Silas sold Eli 20 head of his best cattle for cash, a price that made his gut twist. But it was fast, and it was quiet. He took the money, a small, heavy canvas bag, and rode a full day east to a different settlement, one where his face was unknown and Henry's name had not yet poisoned the air. He bought a sturdy wagon, one with a canvas cover that had seen weather but was still sound. He bought 2 strong, thick-necked mules to pull it, better for the mountains than horses. He loaded the wagon with the essentials, 100-pound sacks of flour, salt, beans, coffee. He bought tins of kerosene, blankets, rope, a new axe head, and 2 heavy crates of ammunition. He bought a new pair of sturdy boots for Clara and a heavy wool coat for her, one that was not haunted by the ghosts of his past. He drove the wagon back, pushing the mules hard, his eyes constantly on the horizon. They left 2 nights later, under the cover of a moonless sky, at 3 in the morning. The cabin was clean, the floors scrubbed, the hearth swept. Clara left Sarah's blue dress, washed and folded, on the trunk, along with a worn, blue and white quilt. They were part of a life that belonged here, a life they were leaving behind. Silas barred the cabin door from the outside, a final, heavy sound. He looked at the grave on the hill, a small, dark shape. He said his goodbyes, silently. Clara was already on the wagon seat, the rifle she now knew how to use resting across her lap. Silas climbed up beside her, his own Winchester by his feet. He took the reins. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low in the dark. She did not look back at the cabin. She looked west, toward the dark, unseen mountains. She put her hand on his, her fingers twining with his. "Ready," she said. He clucked to the mules, and the wagon creaked, lurching forward. Away from the ranch, away from Wyoming, away from the past. They did not speak again until the sun, a pale, gray light, broke the horizon, and the ranch, their small, poisoned sanctuary, was lost to view. They headed west, toward the Oregon Territory, a name that felt like a prayer. Silas knew the land. but not this far. He knew the back trails, the high passes that would be clear of Hendry's men, but would be harder, more dangerous. They traded the open, windswept plains for the jagged, pine-choked foothills of the mountains. The journey was a new kind of trial. The world was no longer just a single, isolated room. It was vast, and it was full of challenges. A late spring storm caught them in a high pass. It was not the dry, cold snow of the plains. It was a vicious, freezing rain that turned the trail into a river of mud. For 6 days, they were trapped. The mules huddled, the world a gray, weeping misery. They lived in the back of the wagon, huddled together for warmth, the canvas drumming with the relentless rain. The old, cold fear tried to find Clara, the feeling of being trapped, wet and helpless. But Silas was not Hendry. He did not curse. He did not drink. He sat with her, his arm a solid, warm presence around her shoulders, and mended their tack by lantern light. "It'll pass," he said, his voice a steady rumble. "It's just water. It can't stop us. It can only slow us down." And she believed him. They were not trapped. They were just waiting, together. Weeks later, on a dry, dusty trail that followed a shallow river, 2 men rode out of the cottonwoods. They were not Hendry's men, but they were cut from the same cloth. Their eyes were hard, their clothes ragged, their hands resting on their pistols. They looked at the wagon, at the mules, at Clara. "That's a fine-looking pair of mules," the taller one said, his voice a lazy drawl. Silas had the wagon stopped, his hands on the reins, his rifle just a foot from his hand. "They are," he said, his voice level, "and they're not for sale. We wasn't asking to buy," the other one said, his grin missing a few teeth. He looked at Clara. "And that's a fine-looking passenger. Mighty lonely out here." "It is," Silas said, his hand moving toward his rifle. Before he could speak again, the canvas flap of the wagon behind him was pulled back. Clara's voice, cold and clear as creek water, cut through the air. "We have nothing you want," she said. She was holding the Sharp's rifle, the big one, its muzzle a dark, cavernous hole. "And we have enough bullets to prove it." The men froze. They looked from Silas, a hard man with a Winchester, to the woman, a pale, steady-eyed woman with a buffalo gun. They were not just a rancher and his wife. They were a matched, dangerous pair. The tall one's smile vanished. "No offense meant," he muttered. He looked at his partner. "Come on, Abe, let's ride." They backed their horses, turned, and disappeared back into the trees. Silas let out a breath he had not known he was holding. He turned to look at Clara. She was still holding the rifle, her knuckles white, but she was not shaking. She met his gaze, a small, fierce smile on her lips. He did not smile. His heart was too full. He just nodded, a deep, profound respect in his eyes. "Good," he said. He clucked to the mules, and the wagon moved on. The greatest challenge did not come from a gun. It came from the water. They had been forced to drink from a stagnant pool, their canteens empty. Silas, with his larger frame, his greater thirst, drank more. 2 days later, the fever hit him. It came on fast, a burning heat that left him shivering and soaked in sweat. By nightfall, he was delirious, muttering about Sarah, about the snow, about Hendry. Clara, who had been nursed, now became the nurse. She was alone, 100 miles from any settlement, with a dying man in a world of danger. The fear was a living thing, a cold hand on her heart. But the woman who had hidden in the hay was gone. She set her jaw. He had not let her die. She would not let him die. She dragged him from the wagon seat into the back, making him as comfortable as she could. She stopped the mules in a small, defensible clearing, a ring of boulders by the trail. For 4 days, she fought for him. She bathed his face, his chest, with cool water from a spring she found. She forced sips of water between his cracked, fevered lips. She sat guard all night, the rifle across her lap, her eyes burning with exhaustion, listening to the coyotes, jumping at every snap of a twig. She was terrified, but she was steady. On the third day, he was weaker, his breathing shallow. He had not eaten. She knew, with a deep animal instinct, that he needed broth. He needed strength. She took the Winchester. She left him, just for an hour, her heart in her throat. She moved into the sagebrush, her movements silent, learned. She did not think. She just acted. She was the hunter. She brought down a jackrabbit with a single, clean shot. She ran back, her hands shaking, and built a small, smokeless fire. She skinned the rabbit, her stomach turning, but her hands steady. She made broth. She forced it down his throat, a spoonful at a time. On the 5th morning, she woke from a cramped, shallow sleep, her head on her knees, the rifle in her lap. It was quiet. Too quiet. She scrambled to him. His eyes were open. They were clear. He was watching her. "Silas," she breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. He was weak, his voice a dry rasp. He looked at her, at the dark circles under her eyes, the grime on her face, the rifle she still held. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched her cheek. "You're still standing?" he whispered. She collapsed against his chest, her shoulders shaking with the sobs of a relief so profound it was almost painful. He was alive. She had done it. The journey changed. He was weak for another week, and she was the one in charge. She was the one who drove the mules. She was the one who chose the campsites. She was the one who stood guard. He sat on the wagon seat beside her, a blanket over his legs, and he watched her. He watched her grow into the person she had been meant to be, a woman of iron and grace. When they came across a traveling trader, his wagon broken by the side of the trail, it was Clara who did the talking. She negotiated. She traded a sack of their flour and 10 rounds of ammunition for a new axle grease tin and 2 bars of soap. She argued the price, her voice firm, her eyes never leaving the man's. Silas sat, silent, and let her lead. She was his partner, in every way. They crossed the mountains in the late summer, the air clear and sharp, the world opening up into a green, lush valley they had only dreamed of. The land was softer here, the trees were taller, the ground was rich and dark. This was Oregon. They were low on everything. The money was gone. The flour was almost out. They were just 2 people, a wagon, and 2 tired mules. At the end of the world, they found the ranch in a small, green valley, nestled by a creek. It was a good, tight cabin, a sturdy barn. But the fences were down, the fields overgrown. A woman was out front, trying to split a log, her movements angry and inefficient. She was in her 50s, tall and raw-boned, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. She stopped as they approached, her axe held ready. "Ma'am," Silas said, touching his hat. "We're just passing through, looking for work, or water." The woman looked at them. She looked at their wagon, their matched, exhausted, but determined faces. She saw their rifles. She saw the way Clara sat, straight and steady. She saw the calluses on Silas's hands. "I'm Agnes Miller," the woman said, her voice rough. "My husband, Thomas, was lost in a logging accident last fall. The place, it's too much for one." She looked at Silas. "You can swing that axe?" "I can," Silas said. She looked at Clara. "And you're not just some pretty piece of parlor furniture." "No, ma'am," Clara said, her voice clear. "I can mend, I can cook, I can tend stock, and I can shoot." Agnes's grim face cracked into a small, dry smile. "I'll bet you can." She pointed to a small, dark shape on a hill, a 1-room line cabin. "It's empty, roof leaks, and the floor's rotted, but it's shelter. You work for me. Help me get this place standing again. You get the cabin, and a share, a full third of whatever we make. Deal?" Silas looked at Clara. Clara looked at him. It was a new world. It was a chance. "Deal," Silas said. The work was hard, but it was good work. It was not the desperate, frantic work of survival. It was the slow, steady work of building. Silas and Agnes worked the fields, mended the fences, re-roofed the barn. They were two quiet, capable people who understood each other. Clara, meanwhile, ran the house. She cooked, she mended. She started a garden that exploded with life in the rich, dark soil. The local settlement was small, just a handful of families, but it was growing. Agnes, over dinner one night, mentioned the children. "They're running wild," she said. "No school, no learning. It's a shame." "I can read," Clara said, her voice quiet. "I can write, and I can do sums." Agnes looked at her, surprised. "Is that so?" 2 weeks later, Clara started her school. Twice a week, 5 young girls, from ages 6 to 10, would walk to the Miller Ranch. Clara would sit them on the porch and, with a piece of charcoal and a smoothed plank of wood, she would teach them their letters. She was no longer just a survivor. She was Mrs. Clara Merrick. She was the teacher. The women of the settlement would stop and talk to her, ask her advice. She had a place. She had a name. Silas, in the evenings, worked on their cabin. He cut and set a new foundation log. He replaced the rotten floorboards. He re-chinked the walls, making them tight against the wind. He built a new, sturdy door. And one day, Clara came home to find he had built a small, covered porch. He was sitting on it, carving. The cabin was finished. It was small, just one room, but it was clean, it was safe, and it was theirs. That evening, Clara walked back from the main house, her heart full. The sun was setting, turning the valley gold and purple. She saw Silas on their new porch, his knife moving over a piece of pine. She walked up the new steps. She saw what he was carving, a small, perfect, 5-petaled wildflower, and she saw, in a long box he had built by the porch rail, he had transplanted flowers, the same bright, brave, yellow and purple ones she had loved in Wyoming. He had dug them up from the creek bed, and he had planted them here. For her. He looked up as she approached, a small, quiet smile on his face. She stopped in front of him. The last golden light of the sun hit her, and she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the air. It was a release, a final, complete thaw. All the cold, all the fear, all the years of running, they were just gone. They were a story that had happened to someone else. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said, her voice thick, the words a profound, simple truth. Silas looked at her, at the woman she had become, the teacher, his partner, his wife. He stood, his large frame blocking the setting sun. He reached out and pulled her into his arms, his rough hand cupping the back of her head, pulling her tight against his chest. He held her, his face buried in her hair, breathing in her scent of soap and sunshine. "You never needed to be," he whispered. Later that night, the cabin was warm. The lamp turned low. They lay in the new bed he had built, a sturdy frame of pine that did not creak, under a new quilt that Clara had made. Outside, the wind whispered in the tall Oregon trees, a gentle, sighing sound, not the high, lonely scream of the plains. He held her back to his chest, his arm heavy and secure over her waist. Her hand rested on his, their fingers intertwined. They lay together, 2 survivors, 2 equals, 2 lovers, finally at peace. They were not a rancher and a runaway. They were just Silas and Clara, and they were, at long last, home. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to hear where in the world you are listening from, so please leave a comment below. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West, so you never miss a new story. We value your thoughts, so please share them with us in English.